and I didn't get it done, but I thought, and I'm going to have to do it, I'm going to buy a whistle. I thought about buying one of those horns that, that they use on boats. I would give just little taps, though. It would be just little taps. It wouldn't be a long one. But last Sunday it was kind of hard to get you all dialed in. So, well, good morning to you. I don't know, am I on? I'm not hooked up to use my mouthpiece. We don't have a system in here to do that, so it's just this. And so I hope you all can hear me. You cannot hear me, Harry? You were able to say you couldn't hear me, so you must have heard me to be able to say that. That's the first thought I had. So, all right. Well, today do you all have notes? Lloyd Fergie is serving as the note passer out person. So if you need notes, see him. And then I want to just reiterate that if you have questions as we're going through the material, I encourage you and invite you to put your hand up and let me know that you have a question, and we will stop and take your question and discuss that together. I have, like today, I have 5 different headings to look at. If we get into a discussion, we might not get through all 5 of those, which would mean that we'd probably try to pick them up and get them the next time around. So I want to find a balance between allowing questions and discussion with the time constraints and just trying to push ahead and get through the material also. All right? So with that being said, we're on lesson 4, and that lesson's entitled Objective Truth. And I want to begin today by defining a term for you, and that is the word tolerance. We don't hear that word, I don't think anyway, as much as we used to. That was a word you would hear very often a few decades ago. You still hear the word, but not as much as you used to. But there is an older definition of tolerance, and then there is a newer definition that has sort of taken its place. And so it's a little bit like, not that I have much experience with this, but if you're a hunter and you kill an animal and you hang that animal up, and of course you're going to, well, I guess you would gut it before you hang it up. Is that right? Would you hang it up and then gut it? I heard yes. I don't know which. No. You gut it first, then you'd hang it. Okay. Well, you can do this with words. So when you gut an animal, I have gutted a fish, for instance, you cut it open and you take all that out. And then with words, you can kind of cut a word open and take the meaning out of it. Here's where the analogy breaks down, because what happens is you take a new meaning and you put it in, and then you sort of sew it all up. Does that make sense? And this happens with words. Words are living things, and so words really can change over time. And a lot of that is a natural kind of process. This is why, for some people, the King James Version of the Bible is hard for them to read, because, the language has changed over time. If you grew up with it, then, you're familiar with that. But for younger ears, they're not familiar with it. And that can be a natural process, and it is an inevitable process, but it can be also, in this instance, it can be a rather malicious process, where you're taking a good word and changing the meaning of that word and then continuing to use that word as if everyone understands what you're saying, when in fact you're saying something different. So the original definition for tolerance, I guess it's not technically a definition, I should read this to you. Tolerance was once understood as respecting a person or an institution even while disagreeing with the position held by that person or that institution. And so the word tolerance actually has its roots in our country in terms of religious liberty. And so you can understand how there are, in our country, there are lots of different denominations, and those different denominations don't agree on everything. If it's truly a Christian denomination, you will agree on the essential things, but there are secondary issues where there are disagreements. And so religious tolerance was the idea that we respect other people, other institutions, and other denominations, even while we disagree with their positions on certain issues. And now what I'm suggesting to you is that is largely gone away. And so this very good word has been redefined in a way that is dangerous. And so today, tolerance is increasingly understood as respecting both the person or institution and the position held by that person or institution. You see the difference there? In the older understanding, you respected the person, but you had the right to say, I think you're wrong. Today it's increasingly, I've got to respect the person, I've got to respect the position equally, to respect the person and what they are believing or what they're doing. And if I fail to do this, then I'm branded as a bigot. And so to understand the difference there between the older definition of tolerance and this newer reality of how the word tolerance is being expressed in our culture is important. Our forefathers would have said tolerance does not mean I have to respect you and everything you do. But today, tolerance increasingly means I have to respect you and I have to respect everything you do. And that's not tolerance, not as is traditionally understood in our culture. So let me give you some examples. And I'm just going to read this to you. And it gets into some of the things we talked about last Sunday. As an example, many Christian colleges in this country have honor codes that they expect their students to uphold. And these honor codes are connected to their doctrinal statements. And these are codes that the students are informed of, and they commit to live under the honor code. If the code is violated, grace is extended upon repentance. Without repentance, the student will not be allowed to continue at the institution. Now again, this is a Christian college. And so it's a Christian college operating out of its deeply held religious beliefs. And so if you violate the honor code, and you are unrepentant in violating the honor code, the college has the right to say you can no longer go to school here. Now there's lots of other options, aren't there? And you can transfer your credits to those other institutions and you can go to school and you can finish your degree. But if you're going to go to this institution, then you have to submit to our honor code, okay? Those codes are written so as to reflect the ethical norms of the New Testament, which means that any sexual activity outside of heterosexual marriage is prohibited. Okay, that's part of these codes. And so that means, of course, and the word any here means a lot, doesn't it? It's not just pointing the finger at one particular sexual sin and saying, you know, this is a sexual sin we will not tolerate. It's saying any sexual sin that is outside of the biblical definition is something we cannot abide by as an institution. So, okay, these codes are written so as to reflect the ethical norms of the New Testament, which means that any sexual activity outside of heterosexual marriage is prohibited. These codes prohibit any and all sexual activity that the New Testament defines as immoral, both heterosexual and homosexual. Okay? Now, we discussed this last Sunday. There is a Christian university today, right now in Canada. It's in Vancouver, or near to Vancouver, I believe. the name of it. It's Trinity Western University. Have you ever heard of it? It's, I believe, and I might be wrong on this, but I think it might be the only Christian evangelical university in Canada. Now, there are Bible schools and there are training schools for Christian leaders. There are seminaries in Canada, but this is more than that. This is more like what we would call a Christian liberal arts university. It's got about 4,000 students, so it would be similar to a George Fox or a Corbin College, Corbin University. Now, this university in Canada has wanted to start a law school, and they have an honor code. And so there have been a series of lawsuits. It finally went to the Canadian Supreme Court, and the university lost. And the lawsuits were on the honor code, and the position of the Supreme Court of Canada was, you cannot have a law school and abide by that honor code. Well, technically, I suppose you can have a law school, but the problem was that in professional disciplines, there's always some sort of a licensing board. And that group in Canada was saying, if you start a law school and you have graduates, we will not license your graduates. So that would mean that, I don't know what it costs to go to law school. I mean, you've got to have 4 years of college, and then I think it's 3 years of law school. So you could be, how far in debt would you be? You could be deeply in debt, and you come out of that university and you have an excellent education, but you cannot receive licensure, therefore you cannot practice law, and therefore your degree is utterly worthless. And you are deeply in debt. Now that's a reality in Canada. And so that university, faced with that reality, what did they do? They took out their scissors and they went to their honor code and they cut their honor code out of their documents. And so now they are in a position of saying, whatever lifestyle you want to live, we'll have to accept that in order to be embraced by the authorities. And, to me, that is a real problem. And it's not just a problem in Canada and in the issue of, say, that law school. By the way, that same university, a decade or so ago, and they actually won in this case. I don't think they'd win today. But it was the same basic issue, but it was related to their education department. Because to be a teacher, you have to have a license, correct? I don't know how all that works, but you have to have a license. And in Canada, they were saying, graduates of this school, we will not give them a license to teach in the public school system of Canada, whatever that looks like. And again, because that was 10 or 15 years ago, it went all the way through, and the university won that case. I don't think they'd win it today. And so this is what I was trying to get at somewhat last week, is this is a reality that we're going to be facing, I think, more and more and more, and it's going to be in all of the so-called professional type folks in our culture, whether it's in medicine or law or education. The pressure is going to be applied, and it's going to be applied at the level of, we won't certify you, we won't give you a license. And you can start to think about hypotheticals. So think of a nurse who's working in a major hospital, maybe not a major hospital, maybe it's a smaller hospital. Some of these would be a major hospital. I've got two examples here. Think of a nurse who works in the surgery department at a hospital that performs abortions. And there have always been conscious protections for those folks, but those are being threatened now. And so a nurse who's forced to make a choice between, I will go into that emergency room and I will assist with that abortion, or I will lose my job. Or I'll lose my license, which means I will not be able to work in the hospital or in probably anywhere. Or another situation, I suppose, would be a nurse who's, again, working on a surgery team, that does sex reassignment surgery. And that nurse says, my conscience it violates my conscience to be involved in something like this, and so again, you'll lose your license. And so you see how the redefinition of tolerance plays into this discussion? And again, the old definition was, I respect you, but I don't have to respect what you believe and what you do. But the new definition is, I respect you, and I have to respect what you do. So, what else do I need to say about this? Let me just read, I guess, some of this to you. Where did I leave off? As we discussed briefly last Sunday, one of the challenges likely to be faced by Christian colleges in coming days is whether or not the government and or the courts are going to allow them to operate free from coercion out of their deeply held religious beliefs. Again, you don't have to agree with those religious beliefs, do you? I'm certainly not saying that. I'm not saying that, you have to agree with me or the doctrinal position of the Stanfield Baptist Church or the doctrinal position of a Christian college or a parachurch organization or the doctrinal position of a orphanage like Catholic Charities that have been kicked out of a number of states now because they have not been willing to place children in same-sex couple homes. And they say, we do not believe that does not conform to our belief system. And so in a number of states, particularly in New England, they've had to stop doing the work that they were doing. So we're not saying that those on the other side of this have to agree with us. We're just asking for respect of the deeply held belief system that we do hold, that's rooted in Scripture. So including their honor codes, especially as it relates to LGBTQ plus issues. And all of this goes back to those issues. It always does. So one can begin to imagine a situation whereby the state allows the school, think about this, I can imagine this. One can imagine a situation whereby the state allows the school to discipline heterosexual immorality and not homosexual behaviors. You see why I can imagine this? This week, or last week, the House of Representatives passed the Equality Act. Now, to go to the Senate, it'll have to overcome the filibuster to be made law, which will be a heavy lift. But you're only talking probably, just a handful of senators would have to change on this. And then, of course, Biden would sign it in a heartbeat. And that would take the civil rights legislation of the 1960s and apply it to the LGBTQ plus agenda. It would, in essence, give that class of people special rights. And so if that were to happen, I could easily imagine a situation where honor codes, say at a Christian college, would be applied to heterosexual immorality issues, but not to homosexual immorality issues. So that's the direction where some of this is going. So the question really does come down to whether or not religious institutions will be respected by the state and allowed to operate fully out of their deeply held religious convictions. You might say, well, what does that have to do with our lesson here, objective truth? Well, all of this is rooted in objective truth, isn't it? Our understanding of objective truth. What is truth? There is a true truth. So let me just stop and just ask you, do you have any comments, any questions, even any pushback before we move forward?
We received an email from Franklin Graham talking about the Equality Act.
Mm-hmm.
It was very short, asking everyone to pray, and also write our senators, representatives. And honestly, we really haven't ever done that before, but we did it.
Mm-hmm.
And they have an email format, and even though we don't agree with their philosophies, we still made a 2-sentence comment and sent that.
Yeah.
And so at least you have something that you can do, something, even though it feels hopeless.
Yeah. And it does at points feel hopeless, and you do wonder, what can I do? And there's a frustration in that. Yeah. But what you did something that was a good thing to do. The Equality Act is the most threatening piece of legislation in my lifetime to religious liberty. And it's ironic that it's called the Equality Act, because it will create special rights for issues of morality that the church cannot accept. And it puts, it's erotic liberty, religious liberty, and in that issue, in our current culture, religious liberty is going to lose consistently when those two come into opposition. Even though the United States Constitution has the First Amendment right, the first right of the United States, of every citizen, is the right of religious liberty. And you don't have anything like that for these other so-called rights. And so the Constitution is actually being thrown under the bus in a lot of this. I think that is an entirely honest. Don't live by lies. I will not lie to you people. I refuse to do that. The United States Constitution is being thrown under the bus in a lot of this. We have rights that are not being respected. They're in the Constitution. They're not being respected. Yeah, Dan?
Just put a statement for our young people on a day-to-day basis. This is a worldview class. How would you state positively, a Christian worldview of say tolerance or something? What would be the positive way of saying it?
The positive way of saying it would be that...
I mean that in regards to how we live our lives as Christians, on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. I would think a positive understanding of Christian worldview is rooted in the Imago Dei, which is the image of God. And so we would show respect to every person and honor every person as a human being with value and dignity, because they are created in the very image of God. And so they inherently have worth and value. And so we would affirm that with an absolute commitment. And that's why, even though we disagree, I disagree profoundly with the LGBTQ plus community, I guess I'll tell a little story at this point. And I'm not going to use the names, although many of you know enough about the story that you'll know who I'm talking about, but I'm not going to use their names. There were two men who lived in Stanfield, and they for years presented themselves as a father and a son. They were, in fact, gay men living in a gay relationship. None of us knew that. None of us knew that they were father and son. We knew that they were homosexuals. That was pretty obvious. One of the younger of these men was dying. He had a specific disease. You can imagine, well, he was HIV positive. He was. And he was dying, and he was at Regency. And I'd known these men for years, and so I went, and I was sitting in that room, and the older man was in the room, and as we were talking, a man walked into that room just from off the streets. And he introduced himself. He named the man in the bed, and he said, "That's my son." And I'm sitting there thinking, well then, who are you? I knew that this guy was a homosexual, but I believed that he was the other man's father. And then all of a sudden, it was like, they've been living a lie. They're actually they're a couple. And so, I stayed for a while and talked, and we shared, and then I got up to leave. And the older man followed me out, and he stopped me, and he said, "I guess this is the end of our friendship." And I took his hand, and I pulled him near to me, and I wrapped my arms around him, and I said, "It's not the end of our friendship, that I actually love you." Now, the young man died. They did not go to this church, and yet he asked me to do the funeral for this person. And so that led to one of the most painful, difficult conversations I've had in my entire life. I went to the surviving partner's home, and had a conversation with him that went probably close to 2 hours. And I said, I will do the service, but I will not lie for you. And so I will not present you as this man's father at the service. I also was going to come out and just say, okay, here's the truth, town, you were told this. I wasn't going to do that, but I would not lie for him. And then it led to a lengthy conversation about what the Bible says about the lifestyle that he was living. And he did not agree with me. But he wanted me to do the funeral. I did the funeral. It was the sanctuary in there was utterly packed out because these individuals were well known in the community. And after all of that, I had a community leader come to me, and they were sharing what they had discovered about the whole relationship. And then they said this to me, and I've always remembered this, and I don't mean to, I'm just going to share what the person said. She said, and by the way, this person does not go to this church, does not go to any church. She said, Pastor John, you are the kindest person in this town. I thought, wow, I don't know if that's true. I don't know that I deserve that. But the way that I loved that man through the situation, even though what he was doing does not agree with my belief system and my values, it spoke to that other person in our community. So I guess that'd be part of the answer, is that we are called to be utterly committed to truth as it is revealed in Scripture. We are also called, though, to love every single person, because every single person is created in the image of God. And by the way, we're all sinners, and the only way we can be saved is through repentance and by God's grace. Does that answer your question, Dan, or not? Okay. Any other thoughts? Or if not, we'll move on to the second issue here on the agenda. We're called to speak the truth in love. Yeah. We're called to speak the truth in love. And honestly, our churches are doing a poor job of speaking truth. And many of them are doing a poor job of loving as well. And obviously, to try to find that balance, we don't do that well. Okay? All right, well, let's move on. This second issue, I really want to say something about this, and I want us to understand this. It's the issue of dignitary harm. Have you ever heard those words together? Put together that way. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard the word dignity before. So dignitary means dignity, and you know the word harm, right? That's when you were a little kid and your mom had made cookies and you got in the cookie jar without permission, and then you thought you got away with it, but there was chocolate on your lips because you were a little kid and kind of couldn't figure it out, and mom or dad caught you. Then you were in trouble, right? You're in a position of potential harm. So we understand harm. So, but to put these two words together, dignitary harm, that's a phrase that you hear this increasingly in the literature dealing with these issues, and you will hear this sometimes at the Supreme Court. This is an argument that is used in support of gay rights. And so I really want us to understand what they're saying. So let me read to you. So this leads to another concept that we need to be aware of. Dignitary harm refers to actions that do damage to another person's dignity or honor. This concept of dignitary harm has been used, even at the levels of the Supreme Court, as an argument for gay rights. You understand why that would be? Does that make sense? As to why someone would say, if you object to the LGBTQ agenda, then you are stripping them of dignity and you are doing harm to them. And so that cannot be allowed. Capiche? Okay, so part of this is, how do we respond to that? So the argument goes as follows. Let me give you some hypotheticals that, as you hear these, if you follow these issues, you'll know these are not hypothetical. These are real situations. So the first one, a gay couple walks into a bake shop that is owned by a Christian, and asked the baker to make a wedding cake for an upcoming gay marriage. Okay, now I just did dignitary harm. You know how I did that? I did this when I said gay marriage. What does that mean? It means I do not believe gay marriage is a real marriage. And I don't believe that because I don't believe the Bible allows me to believe that. Jesus Christ, when he talks about marriage in the Gospels, he goes back to Genesis 1 and 2, and he says that God brought one man and one woman together in a union relationship that's designed to be for life. So even Jesus, sometimes it's said, well, Jesus said nothing about these issues. Well, Jesus did actually say quite a bit about the biblical understanding of marriage. Plus, on this issue, the Bible is really consistent from Genesis all the way through. The Old Testament, the New Testament. We understand there is discontinuity in the Bible, don't we? At one time, the people of God could not eat pork, and now we can't eat bacon. So there's discontinuity there. And so Old Covenant, New Covenant, there is discontinuity as you come into New Covenant life. But there's also lots of issues where there is continuity. Another example of this would be the Ten Commandments. There's one commandment where there's some discontinuity. Which one would that be? Sabbath, right? There's continuity, but there's discontinuity because the day, my understanding would be the day is changed in honor of the resurrection. So the Sabbath is a Saturday, but we're here on Sunday. So there's significant continuity, but there's some discontinuity. The other 9 commandments come straight through, and they're reaffirmed in the New Testament. Specifically, the Sabbath is the only one that is not reaffirmed in the way the other 9 are. So this is another category of continuity, discontinuity that we need to understand. When you look at, say, homosexuality, there is some discontinuity because in the Old Testament, if you live in that lifestyle, it's a capital crime. But there is so much continuity. So in other words, the Old Testament it's not just that there's old covenant law that says this lifestyle is unacceptable to God. That is reaffirmed in the New Testament by Paul and by Christ and by the other apostles. And so that matters, the amount of continuity. But anyway, that's sort of aside. So we've got a gay couple, and they've come into a Christian baker's business, and they want him to make a cake to celebrate their gay wedding. And he says to them, I cannot do this, and the reason I cannot do this is because I have a deeply held religious conviction, and to do this, to celebrate what my art is meant to celebrate, because he views himself as an artist. Photographers do also. Florists do also. This would violate my deepest held religious convictions, and I cannot with a good conscience do this. And then he says, there are many bake shops that will do this, and I've even talked to some of them, and so I'm going to give you 3 or 4 referrals, and I'm giving your business to someone else. Now, the old definition of tolerance would have come into play here and said, what he's saying is, I respect you, but I cannot respect what you're doing. The new definition of tolerance is, I must respect you, and I must respect your lifestyle. And so the couple, they leave the business, and what do? They sue. They go to the civil rights authorities in their state, the Civil Rights Commission. Different states have different names for this. And then there's a lawsuit brought against the baker. And I'm thinking of Jack Phillips, right? Masterpiece Bake Shop in Colorado. And he has been sued over and over and over again on this specific issues. And of course, he's not the only one. Florists have been sued. Photographers have been sued. And this is just the beginning. I think this is going to grow and grow and grow. So the concept of dignitary harm is increasingly being used in lawsuits. Again, the argument is that the refusal to provide service does dignitary harm, and therefore a denial of that service should not be allowed. So I have a question for you. This is a thought question. How do you evaluate the dignitary harm argument? Let's just take a few minutes, and if you have any thoughts, how do you evaluate this argument from a Christian worldview? If we're going to push back on this, how can we push back on this? And you realize, of course, that the issue of, say, the LGBTQ array agenda, is it a civil rights issue or is it a morality issue? You see, Christians are viewing this as it's a morality issue. This is a violation of God's will and intent. And because I'm a Christian, that means Christ is my Lord and my Savior. I must submit to Him. I must submit to Scripture in these areas. The other side is saying, no, this is a civil rights issue. And so if a minority comes to your place of business and you say to them, you can't come in here because I don't want to serve you, most of us would say that's really abhorrent. Okay, well, we'd also say that race is morally neutral and this other issue is not. But how do you respond to this? How do you evaluate the dignitary harm argument? Any thoughts?
Just turn it around.
Okay, what do you mean? Because I think you're on the right track.
I'm a baker and a guy walks in and says, I'm having a homosexual marriage, I want you to bake me a cake. The guy says, I can't do that because of my beliefs. The homosexual couple says, you're causing dignitary harm. And the baker should say, okay, but you're causing me dignitary harm.
Yes.
So we're at a stalemate here.
Yes.
Nobody wins this argument.
So Lloyd Fergie gets an A+++. Because that is exactly the argument. So it needs to be understood that dignitary harm is reciprocal. If you're taking notes, that's the fill-in. I'll spell it to you because that's a hard word, especially for guys to spell. I think women can outspell men, right? I think that's true. So there might be exceptions to that. I don't know. There are some men who are spelling champions. Maybe I've made is that a sexist comment? Is cancel culture going to go after me now? I've done dignitary harm to men by saying that women are better spellers. If you need help, here it is. RECIPROCAL. Well, I misspelled it. But that's what I have, reciprocal. So let me read here. It is incredibly harmful, and I cannot emphasize that strongly enough. It is incredibly harmful to coerce a person to do something that violates their deepest held beliefs. Isn't that true? I'll read it again. It is incredibly harmful to coerce a person to do something that violates their deepest held beliefs. To try to force someone to celebrate something that you cannot celebrate because you deeply, profoundly believe that to celebrate this dishonors God. And so if you go through with this, you will bring great shame upon yourself because you're doing something that your conscience does not allow you to do. And that is the place where so many of these Christian business owners find themselves, and where so many of the rest of us might find ourselves in short order. Going back to the nurse who says you have to assist in this abortion procedure, or the lawyer who cannot receive a license because he will not sign the dotted line that says, I believe that the homosexual lifestyle is perfectly acceptable. But to do that would violate his or her, their sense of their deep convictions. And so you see, this argument, it really does cut both ways. This might get me in trouble because maybe I shouldn't say this. We might even think of this, of this harm that is done to a person as being somewhat akin to like a spiritual or emotional rape. You see how I might get in trouble for that, because I mean, if if someone's here today and they've actually experienced rape, you might get angry. It's like comparing things in our culture to the Holocaust. That gets people in trouble. Because the Holocaust is like a uniquely awful event, and how can you compare something to it? So please give me some grace. But it does seem to me that, to coerce someone and to spiritually sort of just strip them out and strip them down and to coerce them, to force them. I mean, that word does come to my mind, is just how wrong that is and how much harm that actually does to a person. I've got two hands up, so I'll take, you were up first.
These people aren't agreeing in blatantly against themselves.
They are, but they don't see that. They're not operating from a Christian worldview. Although I do think, Janice, that at some level, I do sometimes wonder, why is this agenda pushed so hard on everybody else? When you're talking about such a small minority in our culture, and it's pushed so hard, and it's pushed by the media, it's pushed by the business community, and I do wonder sometimes if it isn't their own inner sense of shame, and they are forcing everybody else to agree with them. And I'll read you a verse, and then I'll let Dan talk, that leads me to think that actually has some biblical warrant to it. And it is found in Romans 1, at the end of this long discussion that Paul gives, where he deals with a lot of these issues. And he says in verse 32 of chapter 1, though they knew God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. And so it's the way we traditionally state this is that sinners love company. And there's just this great desire. If everybody else agrees with me on this, then I think it's rooted at some level in their own inner sense of shame. They know it's wrong. And so they're just adamant that everybody's going to say it's right.
Where's that from?
That's Romans 1:32. Dan?
Don't you think that whole idea is a misunderstanding, really, of where your value of worth comes from? Because to say my dignity and honor is rooted in my sexual identity that's not a good way to identify yourself. A Christian worldview, you say my identity, my dignity and worth comes from the fact that I'm created in God's image. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it is not rooted in what what I do, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's why the argument doesn't make sense to me from a Christian worldview, because we affirm that person's dignity and honor, but we have to disagree with what they do because of the objective truth.
Yeah. I agree with that, absolutely. So, I have a few other things I want to say here, and then we're going to quit for today. I do want to emphasize, though, that people originally came to this country seeking freedom from precisely the kinds of behaviors we're talking about, the kind of coercive things we're talking about right now. It was in the religious arena, largely. But they came to this country and they established liberty to prevent what's happening right now, that people would be forced to violate their conscience. And so American liberty is this unique experiment where we have said we have the freedom to live according to our convictions. Now, there are limits to that, of course. But I want to touch on something else that has to do with dignitary harm. And I want to read to you, I'm reading from Al Mohler from his podcast, The Briefing, which I've not made mention of Al Mohler's podcast, The Briefing. At some point, we might listen to one of these, because if there's one resource that I would say to you, that you could put on your phone if you have a smartphone and just listen to it Monday through Friday, it would be The Briefing. And Al Mohler is the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, very smart guy, and he just takes issues in the news and evaluates them through a Christian worldview. And so this last week, right now in the Senate, you have all the confirmation hearings for the Biden administration. And Merrick Garland is Biden's person appointed to be the next Attorney General of the United States. Merrick Garland, you might remember his name because he was up to be a Supreme Court justice, and the Senate would not, when Republicans held the Senate, they would not move forward with that. So he has a long legal history. Attorney General is one of the four big offices, in the President's cabinet. You've got Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury, and Attorney General. So this is a hugely big, powerful position. And so he would be replacing Bill Barr, who was the person in the Trump administration. So he's before the committee that's evaluating him, and they're asking him questions. So that's the context as I begin to read. So National Review's reporting this, and Mueller's reporting on their reporting. President Biden's nominee for Attorney General, Merrick Garland, declined to say whether transgender females should be allowed to participate in women's sports programs during a Senate confirmation on his nomination that was held on Monday. Just stop, make sure you understand this. A transgender female is a biological male. You all understand that? And so this is someone who's a biological male but is wanting to pass as female in the public school system and play sports. Is this a current issue? This is a current issue. It's absolutely a current issue. If you're not aware of this, you need to do some study on this. There's some excellent videos of some track athletes in, what state are they from? Do you remember?
Colorado.
No, it's more east. Connecticut. It's Connecticut. Yes, a young female I think she's a distance runner. I don't remember that for sure. Anyway, she's a track cross-country star, and she's losing to two transgender females. These are African American biological boys who are running against her, and they're winning state championships. And so she is not only losing, but she's losing scholarship opportunities. And so she is suing, and the Trump administration supported her. The Biden administration this week withdrew their support. That's right there showing a hand. So again, this is part of that process. Biden has signed an executive order calling on schools to allow transgender athletes to compete in sports competitions that match their gender identity. Various state legislatures and some parents of female athletes have protested that doing so would unfairly allow biological males to compete against women. Do you agree with that that's unfair?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think most Americans do, honestly. But there is so much pressure to not say that. So Senator John Kennedy, that's not the guy from Massachusetts who was president, This is Senator John Kennedy. He's from Louisiana, I believe. He's a Republican, and he asked Merrick Garland, Judge Garland, whether he would agree that allowing biological males to compete in an all-female sport deprives women of the opportunity to participate fully and fairly in sports. The Attorney General nominee said, "That is a very difficult societal question." Senator Kennedy then retorted, "I know, but you're going to be Attorney General." Meaning, I know, but you're going to have to make decisions based upon this, and we have a right to know what decisions you're intending to make. After being pressed by Senator Kennedy, Judge Garland responded, "I think every human being should be treated with dignity and respect." Now that's the dignitary argument, right? The particular question of how Title IX applies in schools is something that I would have to look at when I have the chance to do that. I've not had the chance to consider these kinds of issues in my career so far. Now, let me just, I could comment. I think I'll just read Mueller's comments. Now, my summary of that is that whatever we're seeing here, it is not a profile in courage. At this point in American public life, it is virtually implausible. I'll just say that it's unbelievable that someone who is at this point in a judicial and legal career and at this point in politics being nominated as Attorney General of the United States hasn't really thought through this issue. Okay, now he's saying tons by not answering the question. He's really showing his hands. Now, when I think it was on Biden's first day in office, he signed an executive order on this issue. And I want to read that to you, at least a piece of it. So I'm just reading you his executive order. Children should be able to learn without worrying about whether they will be denied access to the restroom, the locker room, or school sports. All persons should receive equal treatment under the law, no matter their gender identity or sexual orientation. So I guarantee you that Merrick Garland, he will be confirmed, and he will support the Biden administration, and that will mean that transgender males will be competing against girls on sports teams, and there's very little, it seems to me, that school districts will be able to do to stop any of this. But what I want to ask as we close, thinking through the category of dignitary harm, can you not see the harm that is being done to all the women, all the young women, all the female athletes that are going to be devastated by this? Don't you think that young woman in Connecticut who's put these videos together and now has been abandoned by the Biden administration, don't you think that she has a dignitary harm issue here? Don't you think that it's probably shameful for her to have to compete against men and to lose in those events? Don't you think that a group of women in a locker room, if they have a biological male coming into that locker room, don't you think that they would experience shame and dignitary harm at that moment?
And he may be hurt as well. They may gang up on him and hurt him. So
Yeah.
you keep looking at this, and it just goes on and on and on.
And even the way that this executive order was written, as I thought about it later, children should be able to learn without worrying about whether they will be denied access to the restroom. No one's being denied access to the restroom. In other words, if you're biological male, the male restroom is available to you, and most school districts are compassionate enough, they would find an alternative, a single restroom that person could use in order to try to address this. But this is going farther, and it's saying we're going to force upon a community like Stanfield where the biological male is going to be using the restroom facilities or the locker room facilities with all the girls in the school. That's where we're at. I think that's insane. And I think it's a denial of science as well. So many of these folks talk about how we've got to follow the science, but they're not doing that. Okay, we've got a ton of other issues that actually connect to all of this, but we're out of time. Any final comments?
What's amazing to me is whether they're Republican or Democrat, the women are not opposed to this.
They are opposed to it. Now stop and think about this for a moment, Wayne. Do you think that, I read to you the words of Merrick Garland, do you think he agrees with this? No, I don't think he does. If he agreed with it, he would have given an honest answer. We would have said it this way in generation, he would have answered without horns. He would have said, yes, this is the policy and we'll pursue it. He didn't do that. I think if you get inside Merrick Garland, he would say this is nuts. But Merrick Garland wants to be Attorney General of the United States. And so he gave this cowardly kind of response. He knows that this is not right. And I think that, so many, but he's folding, yes. And I think so many women, I guess I would just say that ladies and men, let's get behind him. I mean, we should make some alliances as evangelical Christians. Can I say this? I was going to say I'll get in bed with a feminist. I would. I mean, on this issue, I would. I mean, I might not disagree with her on anything else in terms of her worldview. But in World War II, Churchill and Stalin got in bed to defeat Hitler. So I think we all need to push back on this issue. And if it creates some unusual bed buddies in order to fight against this, then we should do that. Because women have to speak, and they're being cowed. You know, someone made the comment the other day that when Bruce Jenner came out, he was voted Woman of the Year. And a feminist said, we can't even win the Woman of the Year award anymore.
Will the lack of logic cause this whole argument to eventually flatten itself?
You would think so, and I hear a lot of people say that. And I think ultimately that's true, but my fear is it'll take 100 years for that to happen. In other words, you know, if you read 1984, there's that concept of, is doublespeak? And you see this actually, we've not talked about this, but right now, I mean, I know there's the whole discussion about math. You know, you've got, you know, 2 + 2 = 4, but there's people now saying that's not the only right answer. And so that's doublespeak. That's a contradiction. And yet in Oregon, they're pushing that kind of an idea. And I think we're at a place where there's so much illogic that it's going to take time before it finally falls apart. I don't know how much time.
Earlier, we were talking about contacting legislators, and that's great, but unless they live in a purple district, they're probably not afraid of anybody. They've already got their time figured out.
One thing that
But what I was going to say is that there are places where you can have a direct impact. You need to start showing up at the school board meetings, city council meetings, and maybe county commissioner meetings. And in Oregon, a lot of their hands are tied because a lot of it flows from Salem. But I will tell you that those elected officials need to understand what their community thinks. And largely, I think they would agree with the community. I don't know that there's too much crosstalk going on. But they sit there in those meetings and they're trying to extrapolate what the community, but the community shows up. It's a very powerful statement. Regardless of whether those elected officials can do what they want.
Yeah.
They may not be allowed to do what the community wants, but at least everybody's on the same page.
Yeah, and maybe that's where a conversation like this could be helpful, because if you're in that environment and you understand this argument of dignitary harm, you can simply point out that, well, that runs both ways, and think about the harm being done to, in this instance, it would be girls in our communities. We got